for about 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to get as much out of this freedom fighter as we can. There we go. Oops. All right. All right. All right. All right. And we are up in five. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. Many of you were asking in the first hour how Reverend Jackson is doing. He is doing great. He is due to be released from the hospital any minute now. Thank God for that. And thank you for your love and your prayers and your concerns. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We've never taken these holidays for granted, and none more so than now. I pray that you will have a blessed holiday this week. You know, it's interesting as I look at my TikTok videos, no one's cooking turkeys now. They're making turkey wings. I think that's a statement on the times. Statement about it. I don't think that people can afford. Maybe making a big Thanksgiving dinner. Think about that. This is not just an affordability crisis. You know, what do they say? The depression is when your neighbor doesn't, well, the recession is when your neighbor doesn't have a job. It's a depression when you don't have one. Well, you ought to be depressed when your neighbor doesn't have a job or when they're not making enough. We really need to think about how we're living very differently. And really, these imperialist impulses that we have, this is something David Swanson of World Beyond War and Roots Action talks about all the time. This medical anthropologist, brilliant scholar, Dr. Adrian Pine, is with us today. I want to start with you, David Swanson, because it seems that we are on our way to war, waging war. Not waging peace, as President Eisenhower wrote about. I just bought that book, the first edition, by the way, Waging Peace. I said, what American president, let alone a former general, wrote a book, Waging Peace? But tell me, why are we even thinking about waging war on Venezuela? What is going on? And does it have global implications, David Swanson?
Well, of course it does. It's one small planet. My late colleague David Hartsoe wrote a book called Waging Peace. I'm not sure if President Eisenhower did that, but President Eisenhower did get the United States government started on this scheme of cheap and quick overthrows of governments in Iran and in Central America that would supposedly not blow back and do any lasting damage. And of course it has. And of course, the New York Times has warned very passionately that New York City cannot afford free buses. But if you see any article about the United States being unable to afford a new catastrophic war, they're going to come, decades after the war gets going, not when it might matter. Which is not to say it's inevitable, which is not to say we can't prevent wars. We have prevented wars on Iran many times since the conflicts with Iran got going, and we have prevented a massive bombing of Syria, and we can prevent wars. But we have to be serious, and we have to be active, and we have to be debunking the hideous lies, and we have to be aware of our own power. The lies are not working. The polling is showing the U.S. public overwhelmingly against a war on Venezuela, even though you had majorities in polls some time back, very, very misleading polls, supposedly supporting the murdering of people on boats. But we have to be smart. We have to not get distracted and answer the wrong questions as they always want us to. It simply did not matter whether Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Yes, no, or maybe was no excuse for a war, for the greatest crime there is. The United States has weapons of mass destruction. It doesn't justify bombing it. Well, it doesn't make the slightest bit of difference whether murdering everybody on a boat is part of a war or not part of a war. It's illegal either way. It doesn't make the slightest bit of difference what cockamamie schemes Trump's lawyers have come up with to pretend that it's part of a war and therefore legal, even though they won't explain what makes the war legal. And at the same time, it's not part of war, and it's not even hostilities, because that way the War Powers Resolution doesn't apply. None of that stuff matters. War is illegal. War is immoral. War is unpopular. And by the time this thing gets going, everybody's going to join New York Times columnist Bret Stephens and claim that it's about spreading democracy and helping the people of Venezuela by bombing them and saving them from their evil dictator. Well, you can't spread democracy against the will of three-quarters of the people on whose behalf you're supposedly acting. It's incredibly absurd, and it wouldn't be legal if Congress authorized it. It's not legal because the Senate voted down, redundantly opposing it. It's not legal because the Speaker of the House is illegally refusing to hold the vote whatsoever. It's sort of extreme, blatant illegality is almost certainly why the commander of the Southern Command quit last month. Why the UK reportedly stopped sharing information with the United States, why this conversation is growing about the responsibility to disobey illegal orders and so forth. But any war promotion comes with a package of lies that include that it's going to be quick and easy, like Eisenhower promised with Iran and Guatemala, right? But it's not. It's the people of Venezuela, the government of Venezuela, the military of Venezuela are going to act just like every single other country that's ever been invaded, and they're going to fight back, and you're going to have an endless war. And it's not going to be law enforcement. It's going to be the exact opposite. It's not going to be spreading democracy. It's going to be the exact opposite. And it's not going to follow an attempt to do something else. It's not going to be a last resort. They're not going to have tried non-war steps and exhausted them as if that were even possible in theory. They are murdering tens or hundreds of thousands of people with sanctions, and then dozens of people with missiles. And they're threatening to escalate the killing and the violence, not to turn it on, but just to escalate it, to be more direct violence and less simply the deadly sanctions. And so, once it gets going, they're going to want to keep it going to kill more U.S. troops for the sake of the U.S. troops already killed and all of that, troopism nonsense, but also to spread democracy, or maybe openly to steal the oil. You never know with Trump bizarro world where the honesty breaks out every now and then, and people like Bret Stephens in the New York Times openly arguing that you should overthrow Venezuela because it's friends with your enemies, Russia and China and so forth, as if wars and overthrows and invasions were legal if someone was a friend of an enemy of someone. Pretty much every country on earth could be invaded now under that rationale. So we should be clear among ourselves, of course, that this is about power, it's about profit, it's about oil, it's about the geostrategic calculations, and it's about Marco Rubio figuring out a way to get Trump to do a war he wants, using the nonsense about drugs. And they've now taken this non-existent drug cartel and made it a foreign terrorist organization. So that you can justify a war by naming an organization that you're going to attack, even though it's the people of a country that you're actually going to attack, a terrorist group, as if doing that isn't itself an act of terrorism, as if that doesn't terrorize people living in Venezuela. And so this is an incredible distraction from the priorities the crises we actually need to be dealing with that are not optional. And it is just disgraceful that after so many of these wars in recent years, and after the glaring live streamed genocide in Gaza, and after the horrendous, final nail in the coffin of the Nobel Peace Prize of giving it to a warmonger in Venezuela, that there would still be this possibility of a war. It's it's to the credit of the U.S. public that for once you have a majority saying no right before they launch a war. But it is to our eternal shame that we're not in the streets, we're not in the offices, we're not surrounding the buildings. In the lead up to the war on Iraq, you saw the opposition. You could look out your window and see it. Where the hell is everybody?
Well, I mean, help me to understand that. I mean, and I did buy these two books by Eisenhower. They were overviews, David Swanson and Dr. Pine, of his White House years. One was The Mandate for Change, and the other was Waging Peace. And I looked high and low so that I could find the first editions, because the other iterations they changed things around. But I thought it was very interesting that he would have that. Then I married that to his 1961 valedictory address. And I said, there's something that has changed here. I think about President Kennedy pushing back on Israel having nuclear weapons, and talking about the Pax Americana. No, we don't want that. And saying that he was going to expose these councils. And then he did, as you say, take us long trip. That's right. Well, now there it is coming right here. I mean, just, it is. I'm wondering what is going on here, because we Americans vote those who voted for President Trump. I'm not saying that they had it right, but Dr. Pine, David Swanson, he said he's against forever wars. No, I mean, and when you said, well, are you sure, everybody? Because, the thing is, even if he's against them, there's another super war machine that oversees the presidency that pushes people in a particular direction, that pushes them into war. So help me to understand what it is that we're looking at, because we have killed at least 80 people. These are people, human beings who are connected to people who love them. And we just drop bombs on these boats. We have seen, I was speaking with historian James Early, who spent a lot of time in that part of the world, who actually knows President Maduro. And they have, he has called on the people of Venezuela to join a militia. They've got at least 15 million people. What are we doing? I mean, David, how or do we think we're going to walk into this country just as these people, these two wayward white children, 20 and 21 years of age, thought they were, I don't know what was behind them, because when you look at how they were able to move around the world to prepare to take over an island, I don't understand the thinking. But, maybe 100 years ago, there would have been a statue to them. One of my previous guests just said, but now it sounds crazy. David.
Well, the other argument we may have for this war as it gets going may be, old is new again, straight up racism without any cover or shading. Just the need to do away with Venezuelans. We'll see. It's very much to the credit of the U.S. public that they try to squint really hard and see which of the two warmongering presidential candidates is the peace one, and choose that one and say they're doing it in the name of peace. It's very, very sad, of course, that we've all been indoctrinated with this idea that we can either, crawl under the bed and moan, or wait and do nothing for almost 4 years and then vote, as if that's, all we're capable of. But, you can't really blame who voted for the one warmonger or who voted for the other warmonger. You were going to get wars either way. It's
Why do you say,
just that.
why do you say we were going to get war either way?
Well, because if Kamala Harris had been willing to say one sentence, "I will oppose the genocide," she would now be president. And she wasn't. It was more important to her to be a good war supporter than to win the election. It was not more important to Donald Trump to be a good war supporter than to win the election. It was, top priority for him to say anything, whether he meant it or not, whether he knew what it involved or not, in order to win. But his plans for peace never existed, and his skull isn't capable of harboring them, and they will be eternally secret, like Nixon's secret plan for peace in Vietnam that we haven't seen yet, because Donald Trump is not a peacemaker. And if peace comes to Ukraine, it's not going to be because of something that he proposed. It's going to be despite the things that he proposed. That being said, we should be encouraging anything he's trying to do for peace in Ukraine or anywhere else, as we should be condemning everything he's doing for war and for open colonialism. I can remember being on your show, Santita, some time back and having a conversation about this madness of putting Tony Blair in charge of someone's country and expecting them to say thank you. This is Donald Trump, but it's not fundamentally different from where we would be if Donald Trump had lost the last election. And so the fact that there's this constituency out there in the voting public of the United States for a peace candidate is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And someday they should be given one, and then they should vote for that person. But we aren't usually given things, as Frederick Douglass said. You have to go out and demand them. And until we learn that there's so much more to do than elections, until we understand that we need to be in the streets, until we realize that this claim that turning out in the streets to prevent the Iraq war was pointless and futile and a big failure is a lie, we're going to be in trouble. Turning out in the streets to prevent the war in Iraq did not prevent the war in Iraq, but it constrained it and limited it and made it illegal and blocked various nations from taking part in it and made it such a badge of shame that we were able to discourage and prevent other wars for years, and to prevent candidates for ascending the throne in the Trump ballroom from being people who had supported the war on Iraq, because it was a badge of shame for years. And that's wearing off. It's fading away. That, Iraq syndrome, that illness that we're accused of having, of opposition to war, is fading, and people are not in opposition to war in the way that we need to be, which has to go way beyond telling pollsters the right thing. I mean, that's great. It's wonderful, but we have to get way beyond that, or we're just going to be able to say we were right, you were wrong, as the war gets going. And in this nuclear age, with these numbers of wars and with the priorities that we need the resources to be going to, this is inexcusable. Zoran Mamdani made a great video that then vanished, where he talked for half an hour about the need to prevent a war on Venezuela from the perspective of needing that money for things in our communities. And I would add the communities of the world, that's not just the United States. That's the amount of money we're talking about. It's just inexcusable that we aren't doing what people in many countries do when they're faced with a crisis, and that is shutting down our government through nonviolent action.
Hmm. Do you think that we will, before you go, do you think that we will be going to war? I mean, where do you think we're going with all this rhetoric and with what we've done thus far?
Well, the crime of threatening war, which is also a crime under the UN Charter, is clearly being committed. You don't give travel warnings and cut off flights and put aircraft carriers and planes and ships and troops and do war drills in nearby countries if you're not threatening a war. I like to maintain the hope that the war can be prevented, that the sanctions can be ended, that a coup attempt can be prevented, as it has been in the past in this country. But I can't predict the future. I can just advocate for working to make it a better one.
Is this about the oil? I mean, I've never seen us go into a place where there was not a profit motive.
There have been endless scholarly studies that try to find a correlation between war and spreading democracy, between countries that both have McDonald's, between countries that have heavy dense population or food shortages, or all the things that all the professors study about, the evils of war that emanate from backward countries in the world. And the one thing that you find a very strong correlation with is the presence of oil and the desire of another country to get those resources. I mean, it's not a coincidence. It's too strong a correlation, and it's very open. I mean, this is what Trump openly says was done wrong in the war in Iraq. That he had to, for a time, pretend he had been against for principled reasons. He was against the war in Iraq, it turns out, because they didn't steal all the oil. Right. And so when you have a president who proudly says if you go to war, you have to steal all the oil, and you have a war threatened on the place that has the most oil, well, I mean, it's not too hard to put those numbers together.
Well, my father called, was it Operation Iraqi Liberation? He said, "Oh, you mean the oil?"
Well, that they did away with that name because they figured out what the acronym would be,
Oh,
but it was comedy that wasn't too funny because that's what it was.
so what would you like for us, before you go? What would you like for us to be on the lookout for? I mean, what should we be doing?
We should be calling the media and telling them that the war is illegal, anti-democratic, immoral, and unacceptable. We should be calling Congress members. We should be calling state and local representatives and demanding that they tell Congress members. We should be contacting peace groups and getting on street corners and coming to Washington, D.C. to protest. We should be signing the petitions and doing the email actions on the websites of the good peace groups. Go to worldbeyondwar.org, go to rootsaction.org. We're trying to put together an event with the better Congress members in DC. We're delivering petitions door to door in DC. Get on the phone every day and encourage others to do the same. And don't believe the biggest lie there is, which is that they won't care and you can't possibly make a difference, because then we're guaranteed to not make a difference.
Thank you so much, David Swanson. World Beyond War. I know Roots Action will be on the ground and we will be working with you, because if we can avoid this war, well, stop it, because we've already started it. If we can stop it, and we can, I think we have the power to do that. We should. We
I
should.
agree. I agree.
David Swanson, much love to you and
Well,
happy Thanksgiving to you and your beautiful family.
and to both of you and to your dad and your family, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. We're getting ready. Dr. Adrian Pine, where do we begin? I mean, it just seems that we don't learn the lessons. I mean, to go into someone's country, we did it in Afghanistan. Every we've not won anything since the Second World War. Roll this back for me. What are we doing? Searching for fentanyl in a country that does not produce it. We say we're looking for drugs. The drugs that we say we're looking for, they don't come out of that place. But what does come out of there is one of the world's biggest tranches of oil. And I don't know how it is that we think that it's our oil underneath their feet. What are we doing?
Well, this is a continuation, first of all, of the Monroe Doctrine, which labels all of Latin America and the Caribbean as the United States' domain, as its purview. And this is going back, 200 years. But secondly, of the continuous efforts of US governments, both Democrat and Republican alike, to effect regime change in Venezuela since Hugo Chavez nationalized the oil industry there. So it's exactly what you're talking about. It's about regime change in order to get its hands on the oil. The lies about drugs are incredibly transparent. As you mentioned, there really are no drugs coming from Venezuela. Definitely no fentanyl, and the tiniest fraction of other drugs even pass through Venezuela. The vast majority of drugs that are being shipped by water from South America to the United States are actually coming through Pacific routes from Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and coming that way. And the United States' own data shows this very clearly. So it's clear that this is a ruse. And even if they were, trying to make it look like the war was about drugs, shouldn't they be going after cartels and not after poor fishermen and, who may or may not, we have no knowledge about whether any of these small boats that have, only a few hundred miles range, many of them, whether
Mhm.
they actually were carrying drugs. And it's certainly possible that some of them were carrying drugs. But if they were, what we're talking about is people who are making who are doing a run for an actual cartel. And shouldn't we be going after the cartels as opposed to the poor people they exploit, to traffic drugs? So it's, first of all, unlikely that the majority of these people were trafficking, but secondly, it's going after the lowest rung, in the most illegal possible way, a legal international war crime of, just merely targeted assassination and outside of the context of war. So the justifications just crumble if we look at them even just for a few seconds. And yes, it's about regime change. And if we even begin just off the top of my head to list the efforts at regime change since Chavez took power and since he nationalized the oil industry, there's the US supported coup that lasted just a couple days in 2002, in which they tried to overthrow Chavez, and there was a massive uprising that forced them to release him after kidnapping him. That was a failed attempt. And then, there's been election interference every election since Chavez was elected by the US, trying to prevent the PSUV, Chavez's party, from winning any seats. More recently, of course, there was the sanctions that were imposed by Obama in 2016, which inflicted massive damage. And we're talking about real violence here, real deaths. The CEPR study in 2019 that came out, this is the Center for Economic and Policy Research, estimated that between in the 2 years following the implementation of Obama's sanctions, which were then intensified by Trump, that those sanctions were directly responsible for over 40,000 deaths. That is the excess mortality that could be measured and directly related to sanctions killed 40,000 people who were not able to access simple medications because of the sanctions, or who were unable to access the food that they needed, things like that. In 2000, the UN Special Rapporteur on Sanctions, Alfred de Zayas, estimated that that number had raised to 100,000 excess deaths that are directly attributable to US unilateral coercive measures. That's what we call sanctions, but really is more appropriately called unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela. So now we're talking well over 100,000, at this point, probably more like 150, 160,000 deaths directly caused by this soft power policy of regime change. In the interim, we have the attempted coup of Juan Guaido being installed in January 2019, and the attempted military coup later that year, in April of that year, when the US tried to orchestrate a military coup from within the military and failed miserably. We had in 2018, the year before, there was a drone attack that was carried out on Maduro during a big rally, and thankfully missed him. There have been paramilitary attacks that the United States has sponsored. So this really, I think it's important that people understand that this is a bipartisan policy, and this is a escalation, yes, but it's a continuation of a regime change effort that has at its core the goal of securing the oil that is in Venezuela. And I think David may have mentioned this, but remember the oil reserves in Venezuela are the largest of any country in the world, including Saudi Arabia, but they're much closer than Saudi Arabia to the United States, and therefore would be much more beneficial. And the United States is facing a situation where its quote unquote backyard under the Monroe doctrine, the Latin America and the Caribbean, is rapidly aligning much more closely economically and politically with China. And it's feeling this threat, and that it needs to secure, again, quote unquote, its oil, its lithium, its mineral resources, that what the United States considers to be its property, that happens to be under Latin American sovereign soil. And that sovereignty doesn't matter to United States corporations, to the United States government, and they will make up any lie that they want to try to get their hands on it. But the thing is, there is tremendous unity in Latin America, a recognition of the violation that this represents of Latin American sovereignty, not just Venezuelan sovereignty. And there's a unity in opposition in the Caribbean and throughout Latin America to this violent aggression in the Caribbean and beyond, and the potential war against Venezuela and also Colombia, because there's a real recognition that this has already taken the lives of people from dozens of different countries with these illegal attacks on boats in the Caribbean and in the Pacific as well, and that it will not be contained to Venezuela. So there was a call that was issued by President Maduro for people to come to support the Venezuelan. You mentioned the what are they called again? The brigades, the militia, the citizen militia. That is massive. It's potentially around a third of the Venezuelan population is armed and training to defend their homeland, which is kind of unbelievable. Like, you have to be a pretty popular president to dole out weapons to anybody who signs up for the militia and understand that they're not going to turn against you. And that's the situation in Venezuela. People understand, whether they like Maduro or not, they understand that the bombs that fall are not just going to target Chavistas. And then that's actually been a saying that they've had, that the attacks on Venezuela are against Venezuela's sovereignty as a whole. They have nothing to do with democracy. They have nothing to do with drug trafficking.
Do we not understand how people are thinking? We would not. I'm looking at the Ken Burns documentary on the American Revolution, and I'm struck by the phrase, "Don't tread on me." And the revolutionaries grew to appreciate sovereignty. They said, wait a minute, we're building this nation. Now, were they doing it the right way? Were they genociding of people and everything that was related to indigenous people? Absolutely. But let's just isolate that if we can. Just for the purpose of this point, these are people who did not want to be colonized anymore. There was a shift in their thinking. And these are people in that part of the world who don't want to be colonized, and they don't want to be treated as children. And they have not discounted race and racism. They haven't. I mean, there's so many pieces that are coming together here. They want their oil. They want to develop their country. They look at Dubai, they look at the Saudis, they look all over the world, and they look at the United States and they say, why can't we not? They're not jealous, they're not envious. They're like, we have everything we need. We have everything that we need. That's what Libya said. That's what Gaddafi said. We don't need you. Yeah. And it's so profoundly insulting for for anyone to say to them, I don't care how big the power, David's the Goliath. We have to be very careful, Dr. Pine, because they are looking at us and they're saying, how dare you come into my country on me? And I think it is so foolish to go into a place that they know. We don't know that place. They know it. And every time we've gone into someone's homeland, look at what happened to us in Vietnam. I mean, we did not win in Korea. We did not win. We've not won any place since the Second World War. What are we doing? And now you've got China coming into our backyard. It's like the Monroe Doctrine has been flipped over on us. Because now they are allied with 1.5 billion people. They can't run out of soldiers. I just need you to help me to understand what the thinking is. I mean, is this hubris?
You know, it's so interesting that you bring up the "Don't Tread on Me" and our revolutionary history, because
Yes.
I think that there are two ways, fundamentally, to have a revolution, and one to throw off your oppressors, and one of them is to say, I'm going to throw off my oppressors so that I can take their place and be like them, which is what we've done in the United States historically. Instead of Britain being the empire, then the US gets to be the empire. The US takes over all of that territory that the former empire might claim. Or you could take a principled position that recognizes shared humanity in other peoples, which was the position of Chavez, which is the position of Maduro, and really advocate for a true internationalism that is anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and that fights and that is anti-racist. And as you're saying, the practice, I mean, everything about the regime change effort against Venezuela has been so profoundly racist, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racist. And we see this even in the sponsorship by the United States of a certain class of people in Venezuela who are predominantly white, and the people who are killed in violent attacks by these people. For example, in the Guarimbas that were promoted by Maria Corina Machado, the recent Nobel Peace Prize winner, very powdered white herself, the majority of victims of these violent street riots were poor Black people in Venezuela. And some of them weren't even Chavez supporters. It was just they were identified racially as targets by these largely or predominantly whiter pro-US crowds. And so you have people like Maria Corina Machado, and recently in an interview, Juan Guaido, who was the imposed faux president by Trump, never became president, but certainly managed to steal billions of dollars worth of Venezuela's resources as a result of that intervention. They've both approved Trump's attacks on the boats and have called for Trump to bomb Venezuela. Who are going to be the majority victims of these attacks? It's not white people. Not white Venezuelans, not other white people. It's people, it's brown and Black people in the Caribbean, in Venezuela. And so I think that very much shapes the discourse that Trump has. We saw that when he labeled all of these Venezuelan migrants, people who came as a direct result of the sanctions imposed in 2016. It's important to note that prior to 2016, when the sanctions were first imposed, Venezuela was a net receiving country of migrants. It was only after the Obama imposed sanctions that were worsened by Trump later that Venezuelans started emigrating from Venezuela, and mostly to other South American countries, but many of them did come to the United States. And so, as we know, when Trump came to power the second time around, he immediately claimed that all of the Venezuelans in the United States were members of this largely imaginary organization called Tren de Aragua. It's a real organization, but it doesn't exist in the way that he claims it does. That is, it's not a gang that has invaded, that is led by Maduro and has invaded the United States. And as it turned out, none of the people who, remember, he illegally rendered hundreds of Venezuelans to a torture camp in El Salvador earlier this year. None of those people had any ties to Tren de Aragua, which was like a regional drug organization in Venezuela that has largely been quashed. So but he was able, using the kind of racist discourse that, it really it brings all of his racism and xenophobia together. The way that he talks about people from other places, he talked about these people as criminals, using the same sort of language that he has used to describe Black people in the United States, a threat to our society, that they were members of this gang. He used the whatever it was, the foreign combatants or foreign enemies, to designate them, to justify deporting them to torture camps. And none of it was entirely baseless, but his deep-seated racism and the structural racism that undergirds our asylum and immigration policy in the United States made it much easier for him to get away with that. And so this regime change attack, we have to see that as a continuation also of his attacks on Venezuelan and other immigrants to the United States.
But let's go back a bit, because you talked about it's a bipartisan betrayal, if you will, of our principles, right?
Yeah.
Because we saw the sanctions under Obama, we've seen them under Trump. There's something that goes beyond party here, right? And you can have a black president, you can have a white one. The policy doesn't change. So I want to know, what is it about, because the policy is, whoever implements it, it's a policy. And I think that we've got to look at that, because we need to understand that this is not Democrats or Republicans. This is something that the oligarchs are looking for. And it's poor people there's a poverty draft in this country.
Yeah.
These rich kids don't fight these wars. They don't. Or certainly if they go to war, they go to Annapolis, they go to West Point.
Yeah.
They don't fight the wars. They don't. And so I need you to help me to understand what it is that we're really looking at, and what we're looking at, how we're being viewed globally, because the world is changing, Dr. Pine. This is something that you study and that you understand. And I want you to help us to understand that this is not 1945. This is 2025. This is a new world. It really is. I mean, we've watched the discourse on everything change. You have young right-wing, young people who are on the right. I'll just say they're on the right, and young Americans who are on the left, who are in agreement on the Middle East. Yeah. They might have come from different directions, but guess what? They're right here. And they're coming together on a whole lot of things. They're really, we're looking at a transpartisan generation. They do not care about these parties. And these two parties have done like this. And I'm wondering what's going on, because how is this going to impact us globally? Because the biggest economy, now mind you, the most complex and the richest economy, just pound for pound, is still the United States, but that doesn't always have to be so. I mean, I'm wondering what the thinking is.
Well, I think You bring up the Middle East and, of course, the genocide right now. It's important to keep in mind that this has everything to do with the genocide. Venezuela is among the countries that has most staunchly supported Palestine. We've seen strong statements of solidarity coming from major Palestinian organizations, including PINGO, for example, which is the Palestinian NGO network representing over 140 member-based organizations in the West Bank and Gaza, coming out in solidarity with both Venezuela and Colombia, which itself, President Petro, has done more than any other world leader at the moment, perhaps with the exception of Yemen, in terms of promising, of supporting Palestinians, of taking really concrete steps to end the export of coal from his country, but more importantly, in terms of the retaliation it has faced over the past 2 months, promising to introduce a resolution called Uniting for Peace at the UN General Assembly, in which the General Assembly could circumvent the veto power of the US in the Security Council and circumvent the kind of horrific colonial resolution that they just passed in the Security Council, to do what all the Palestinian factions, with the exception of the PA, have been calling for, which is to introduce protection forces, to send a multinational protection force to Gaza in order to protect Palestinians from the genocide, in order to open humanitarian corridors. So all of this is to say that Petro has taken this very bold stance in solidarity with Palestine, and as a result, he's had his visa revoked, he's been sanctioned, his country has been dropped from the cooperation list, they've had all their aid taken away, they've been labeled as a I can't even remember, like, cooperative country, they've been bombing Colombian citizens, they've threatened them with war alongside their Venezuela regime change effort. And it's entirely, the countries that are being threatened by the United States are all the countries that ally with Palestine, and all of the enemies, all of the opposition in those countries is staunchly allied with Israel. So Maria Corina Machado, her party Vente Venezuela, has an actual formal alliance with the Likud party, and she has personally celebrated Netanyahu on numerous occasions. Same with Juan Guaido. And the right wing in Colombia is extremely Zionist. In fact, it was Israel that trained the paramilitaries in Colombia that killed over 200,000 people in that country. So the connections really point to a crack, an enormous crack in US control over its Zionist empire, and the sort of Israeli model, this global Israel of exporting technologies of repression around the world, and aiding the United States in its installing fascist governments around the world that are allied with Israel so that it can continue its settler colonialist project. And one more thing, and going back to what you were talking about, I think it's really important to keep in mind that the United States is using Puerto Rico as a staging ground for its regime change effort against Venezuela, and all of the violence it's carrying out against Puerto Rico's neighbor countries in the Caribbean. And Puerto Rico is very much like Palestine. It's a colony that is taken over. The people of Puerto Rico are suffering under incredible US economic and political violence. They're racialized, and the racism, the structural racism, is part and parcel of US domination and violence against Puerto Rico. And now Trump has reopened a base that had been shut down in Puerto Rico, again, as the staging ground for these operations that are meant to, kill countless other brown and black people in Venezuela in order to get their hands on the oil. So race, Israel, US empire crumbling, all of it is part of this story.
Dr. Adrienne Pine, help me to understand where you see this going.
It's such a good question, and I wish I had a clear answer. What I can say is that is that Venezuelans continue to live their day-to-day lives. There's a lot of tension from my conversations, and I have a lot of friends who are in Venezuela, some of them supporters of the Maduro government, some of them not. But what they tell me is that they're on edge, but they're continuing to live their lives, and there is a very firm um, rejection across the board of Maduro opponents and supporters alike of US intervention, because everybody knows that it's not going to end well. It's not going to fulfill any sort of goal that Maduro opponents have of installing a better or more democratic presidency. And certainly, according to those people, and then, the people who are Maduro supporters recognize very well, again, that this is about violence against them, against their infrastructure, against their right to life.
Is this about democracy?
Oh
Or
no,
is this
it has. We both know it has nothing to do with democracy.
I'm just, for the audience, I'm asking, because,
Right.
we hear this all the time, and then we tell this to the young people who join the military. They get there, they find out something different, they come back different, and they come back very angry. And it manifests itself in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what I can say, I think, going back to what I had said originally, there is a real unity in Latin America among peoples of Latin America. So not in terms of the presidents. There are some extreme right-wing presidents that are allies of the United States and Israel, like Javier Milei in Argentina, like Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, like the drug trafficking Daniel Noboa in Ecuador. And so those governments are not supporting Venezuela. But even governments that have opposed the Maduro presidency, like Lula in Brazil and Petro in Colombia, have made it very clear that they strongly stand by the side of the Venezuelan people at this moment against UN intervention, and that they will defend Venezuela. And on the other hand, the peoples of all of Latin American and Caribbean countries have, through organizations, through popular movements, have made it crystal clear that they firmly oppose this. There have been international brigades, kind of like in the war against Franco in this 100 years ago, coming to Venezuela to support, like I said, to support the militias. And there is a really strong sense of unity in the hemisphere, outside of the US and Canada, that they will stand up to this. And I think we're waiting to see what China and Russia, how they might respond. They've been overly, in my view, but I mean, I don't have their calculus, but they've been very cautious in standing up to the United States. They did not veto the Security Council resolution, the disastrous Security Council resolution to send in an occupying force to Palestine, and they have not said openly that they will engage if the United States invades Venezuela. Nonetheless, they have both increased their trade with Venezuela, and I believe China has sent a fair amount of military equipment to Venezuela in recent weeks. So there's that sort of support. So my guess is that the U.S. will not do a land invasion, but that it will continue to increase its airstrikes and its efforts at paramilitary activity in Colombia, just because it knows how much it would be risking if it really did a full-scale invasion. But again, it's hard to say. I mean, as you've mentioned, the people who would be doing the invasion would be people who are less valued along, the lines of racial capitalism in the United States. So, yeah.
Racial capitalism, that is loaded, and it is true. What would you like for us to be on the lookout for? Because it seems that something is happening, and with the need for distractions, because we have a lot of things going on domestically. And what should we be looking out for? And in your estimation, you're so brilliant, and I thank you for your for using these stellar academic credentials and understanding to really help us to understand the world and make it and make it what it's supposed to be. I mean, it's not you're not supposed to just learn, and it's not supposed to be static. It's supposed to be dynamic. And thank you for that. What should we be looking? Oh no, thank you. Really, we are in your debt. What should we be doing? What should we do? What should we be looking out for? How are we to analyze this when we're watching this on the news? Because 70%, according to the CBS poll, 70% of Americans are saying, I don't want any part of this.
Yeah, I mean, we need to be looking for the connections, and the connections are very, very simple in many ways. I mean, all of that money that is being spent on amassing this huge military presence in the Caribbean is not being spent on our healthcare. It's not being spent on our education. I mean, that's one connection that is very clear. The vast overspending on US military budget is actively harming us here in the United States. But then there are more connections. Any issue that you want to pick, you can find the connections to Venezuela. You can find the connections to Israel. Looking at the repression of migrant communities in the United States, the technologies that ICE are using in many cases have been developed by Israel for repression against Palestinians, the monitoring technologies, things like that. The police forces that are repressing brown and black communities in the United States have had training programs done in Israel. Again, the strongest proponents of war against Venezuela are the strongest allies of Israel in both in Venezuela, because they share the same goals. And I mean, Marco Rubio, look at Marco Rubio.
I mean, they're half a world away. What interest do they have?
Well, you know, and this is a colleague of mine named Majid Shihadeh, who's a Palestinian scholar, has written about the idea of global Israel, which is what he calls this fact that, you know, Israel has worked really hard since its invention as a state. It has been involved. I mean, if we look at Latin America, it's been involved in every single regime change operation, every single coup, alongside the United States, with the intention of installing Israel-friendly governments in those places. And the reason it's doing this is because it's engaged in a project of settler colonialism against an indigenous people that is out of date. It's wildly unpopular. Colonialism, the era in which people, you know, supported colonialism is gone. And so in order to maintain its violent colonial project, it has exported its ideologies, its technologies of repression. It has exported genocide. In Guatemala in the 1980s, the major supplier of weapons to General Rios Montt, who himself was a fervently Zionist evangelical Christian, was Israel. And so Israel has worked really hard to create a global network of Israel supporting regimes, in other words, fascist regimes that are dependent on its technology. We even see this with the Epstein file, with the recent reporting on not the sex trafficking stuff, but the work he was doing together with Israel to directly impose Israeli technologies in different countries, like Cote d'Ivoire, for example, to sell Israeli repressive and monitoring technologies to repressive governments around the world, to ensure that they would be in some way subservient to Israel and have that tie and continue to support it in its ongoing genocidal project. And so, I mean, it almost sounds tinfoil hat if you look at it, just a glance at it, but it's something that is actually really true. All these ties exist, these economic ties exist, these political ties exist. And so in order to understand, you know, what is happening in any country, one of the key questions you need to ask is which players are connected to Israel and which players are supportive of Palestine, and what have been the interventions over the years, what have been the coups, what role has Israel played, and what has resulted from that. And I mean, it's truly astounding if you take a good look at it. But I think keeping that in mind, and also keeping in mind the fact that all of these things that we talk about as if there's something happening over there are directly impacting those of us who are here. That we can't talk about invading Venezuela without talking about the incredible upheaval that will create, and the migration toward the United States, not just in Venezuela, but throughout the entire region. The violence and impoverishment that will ensue, the fact that any benefit that may come from the oil is only going to go to major corporations and the 1%, and will not be redistributed. It's not going to have any benefit for anyone in the United States other than the billionaires. So I think always remembering those connections, always asking, what is this thing? Like, I just got my health care taken away. I just lost my SNAP benefits. How does that connect to Venezuela? How does that connect to Israel? And it does pretty quickly if you take a look, if you connect the dots.
Well, as my mother says, you can't hurt me without hurting yourself. And you also can't help me without helping yourself. The fact is, if everybody in this hemisphere and in the world had what they need, what a wonderful world it would be, really. If
Amen.
everybody were able to develop fully and become who they're supposed to be, what a wonderful, 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 wonderful world. And that is the goal, everybody. That is not pie in the sky. We are but a thought away from transforming this world and bringing heaven right down here on earth. And I mean that. And we should do that. And I thank God for Dr. Adrienne Pine. I'm so glad that I was able to get you today. I salute and really bless the God in you. And thank you for recognizing that in all human beings, because we are all brothers and sisters, everybody, sisters and brothers. God bless you, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving. I'll see you tomorrow, but happy Thanksgiving, and share with someone. Invite someone over. Be kind. That's right. Everybody deserves to be loved all the time, especially now. I'm Santita Jackson, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive